Good afternoon all. Thank you so much for joining our webinar this afternoon, Exam Appeals, Hints and Tips. We will just wait for 30 seconds or so to allow everybody to join. That's due to do so. Right, I think that everybody would have joined now. Just to identify, we have pre-recorded this webinar, so this information is accurate as at Friday the 30th of July 2021. If the proverbial hits the fan between then and the date of this recording going out, we are not responsible for any changes. Thank you so much for joining this conversation between Ben Fullbrook and myself about potential appeals following on from the GCSE and A-level results, which this year are due to come out for the A-levels on the 10th of August and for the GCSEs on the 12th of August, so around a week or 2 weeks earlier than would usually be the case. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us today and hope that you will find the discussion informative. My name is Fiona Scolding, Queen's Counsel, and I will be leading the discussion, joined by my colleague Ben Fullbrook, who I will introduce in a moment. To begin with, a few housekeeping points. Your microphones are automatically muted. The webinar will be recorded and there will be a link given to all of you shortly afterwards, or you can see it on our YouTube channel. We have almost as many hits as some other sets of chambers, obviously significantly fewer hits than Rabbit's skateboarding. If your connection's lost at any point, please do rejoin the meeting. And whilst we have disabled the Q&A, we are happy to take any questions. Please do send them to the marketing team, who will send them on to us. So both Ben and I are part and parcel of the education team. I was involved on behalf of the Good Law Project, along with a number of members of Chambers, with the proposed judicial review to the last year's mutant algorithm, as it became known, I believe, by the Secretary of State. Ben is also a member of the education team and has undertaken work both on behalf of students and schools, advising about exam processes. And we both, we hope, have a good understanding of the appeal process for this year, which is different to previous years. So a change is as good as a rest. So we're going to run this seminar in the form of a discussion between Ben and I. And if there are any questions and queries, as I've already said, which come out of that, please do email us with them. So Ben, the first question I have, which is the question which I always get asked by everyone's sons and daughters, is I haven't got the grades for university, for my university of choice. Should I appeal the grades that I have been given? You're on mute, Ben.
That was a good start, thanks. The answer to that is not, not necessarily. It depends on what your other options are, really. I mean, the first thing to do, really, I think, if you don't get the grades you need, is check with your university of choice to see whether they will still accept you, because it's not unheard of at all for universities to say, we recognise you haven't got the grades, maybe there were mitigating circumstances, etc., and they still offer you the place. So the first thing you really should be doing, I think, if you don't get the grades you want, is picking up the phone to the university you want to go to and trying to explain the situation. If that doesn't work out, then obviously you can consider clearing as well as an option. And as far as I know, clearing is taking place this year. It's possible there might not be as many clearing places because perhaps students are more likely to get their predicted grades than they would be on other years. But nevertheless, you could try to go through clearing. And obviously there are many students who are very happy with the places that they get through clearing. and that can be a really good option for people. And what it means, I suppose, as well, is you don't have the uncertainty of going through the appeal and waiting to hear whether your grades are going to change. Or you could defer your entry for a year, go and take a gap year. You might be allowed to travel somewhere next year, I don't know. But there are lots of options. You don't have to appeal, and it's not necessarily your first resort. Definitely check the universities, definitely see if there are good clearing places available as well.
I think the position is that because universities took a larger number of students this year, I understand they have taken a smaller number of students who are anticipated to come in October and have already deferred quite a lot of places for next year. So this year might not be the year to take a gap year, because I think they've already filled some of their spaces. The other thing I would say is, although I think there is flexibility for some courses, for things like medicine and law, which are already very heavily oversubscribed, the likelihood is that if you don't make your grades, they will not let you on the course unless there are some pretty specific mitigating circumstances. I mean, obviously never say never, and those tend to be the sorts of courses where people telephone you and I on the 10th of August at around 11 a.m. saying, it's not fair, I was meant to be going to do medicine, what's going to happen? So one of the questions that people often ask us is, obviously this year the exams haven't taken place. I mean, this is all reliant upon teacher assessment grades, which is fundamentally different to the way that exams have been run, certainly over the past decade, after really the reduction of coursework in the majority of GCSE and A-level courses in any event. But what's quite interesting is Ofqual last week, who are the body who are responsible, who are charged by the government for making sure that the exam system works in effect. They've just published a series of research they've undertaken about whether or not teachers get their assessments right in respect of grades. And obviously 2020, because it ended up being in effect the teacher assessment grades that we used, there's therefore a massively larger amount of information and data about how teachers marked and what they marked. And what they've shown, which is quite good, is whilst the grades were slightly inflated, they think by about half a grade compared to what would have happened during the exams, they didn't actually show any substantial bias. And particularly importantly, for those who live in areas of higher deprivation, it in fact showed that young people in those areas in fact got higher grades than had been the case previously. So maybe demonstrating that there is some value in having people who have a real understanding of the children and their potential undertaking the assessment can have some value. So the likelihood is that most of the teacher assessment grades will be right. So that's the other thing I would say before you appeal, is I think you have to think long and hard. Do I really think that they've got this wrong? Or, and if I do think they've got it wrong, why? Because, so Ben, I turn up, I want to do medicine at Edinburgh. I need, unsurprisingly, the highest grades. I've dropped a grade in a subject. I can't understand why. I don't know the reasons for it, but I definitely want to appeal because I think that maths teacher definitely had it in for me and definitely marked me down. How do I appeal? What do I do?
Well, there are two stages and to the appeal, two types of appeal, and we have to follow both, especially if the first one doesn't go right. So the first thing you need to do is you need to undertake a centre review. So the centre, as most people probably know, is the school or college which actually carries out the assessment. There are no sort of set formalities for this, but there is a form available on, I think it's linked to the JCQ, the Joint Committee on Qualifications website, where you can fill it in and put all the relevant details, and you need to submit that to the centre or to the school.
And can we suggest that everyone who's here on behalf of schools uses that template form, so you have copies of that template form ready to go, or in fact provided on your website in advance, so it can just be filled in?
and that's a really helpful form. It'll make sure that everyone filling it in gets all the right documents and knows the scope of the appeal. And also, I think if you're a student, you should seek to obtain, and your centre should be readily providing you with access of their policy, the sources of evidence that they use to determine the grades, details of sort of any variations in the evidence used based on disruption to what the student's been taught, and details of any special circumstances that they've considered or reasonable adjustments that they have made for.
And if I can say, most of that information, other than the actual grade, should already have been discussed between parent, child and teachers. So the centre policy had to be published. So you should be able to find that on the website if you're representing, if you're a parent or a student, or ask the school for it, because that all had to be published at Easter last year. And then you should already have had a discussion about what evidence was going to be used. And the school should already have sorted out any mitigating circumstances or reasonable adjustments.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying that, you know, if you're in a position now where you're nervous about your grade and you're, you know, for whatever reason, you've got reason to think you're not going to get the grade that you want or need, you can start preparing now to start that process rolling. And, you know, as I sort of outlined, it's quite a document heavy process in some respects, and so it's good to have, you know, good to get on the front foot. But that's your first, and we'll go in that there are limits to the grounds of appeal that you can bring to the centre, which I think we'll come on to in a bit, Fiona. But then there's, if you are not successful in your centre appeal, then there's a second appeal that you go through, which is an appeal to the awarding organisation, which is, I think, basically the exam board.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's a template for that on the JCQ website, which we would advise using. An important quirk of this is that you as a student or parent don't bring or cannot bring an appeal to the awarding organisation. The centre has to submit it for you, which of course, you know, is it's very odd at the moment, given that the centre, all these grades are teacher assessed, and it is the centre that has assessed you. It is effectively appealing against its own judgment. But you will be comforted to know that the guidance, especially from the JCQ, is that centres must, if they're instructed to submit appeals by students or parents, they must do so, and to refuse to do so would be malpractice on their behalf. So it's a bit odd that the centre has to appeal itself, but it must do so, and they can't refuse to bring the appeal. So it's worth knowing that. So that effectively is the appeal. If you do an awarding organisation appeal, they might look at it themselves, a member of staff, or they might appoint an independent reviewer as well to look at it. And again, there are set grounds which you can appeal to the awarding organisation, which we'll come to.
Okay, so I mean, just sort of following on from that, the most important thing you're going to need is you should already have, if you're a student or a parent, or the school should already have given you, this is the evidence we're going to use, this is that. But what you won't have is that your marks, and they are not allowed to give you the marks until the day that they're released to the public. And if the school does do that, that in and of itself would amount to malpractice. But what I think so students need to be ready to ask for that information, and schools in effect need to be ready to give it. Now, schools, as we know, get the information about the grades several days before they are given out. So what I would say is, where there has been a significant variation between expectation and grade awarded, schools are likely to know about, at the very least, some of those, and they will certainly likely to know about cases where people's grades will not meet their expected university place. Most of the time, you know that. So I think in those cases, it's probably worthwhile having the pack of papers ready to literally give to the student at the same time as they give them the bad news, so that they can go away and think about it. Because the deadlines, Ben, if you could tell us what the deadlines are, they are incredibly short.
They're really short. Now, there are two types of appeals. There are priority appeals and non-priority appeals. Now, priority appeal is for students applying for higher education who can't get their first choice, or what they call their firm choice, which is the offer accepted as their first choice. So you will be a priority. And if you're doing a priority appeal, the window for requesting a centre review is between the 10th and 16th of August. So very
so that's a week.
Yeah, it's a week. Then the window,
less than a week.
Less than a week, and then there's the centre will have to do those reviews very quickly, because the window the window for conducting those is just 10 days between the 10th and the 20th of August. And then you have until the 23rd of August to submit your appeal to the awarding organisation. So it could be that the centre drags its heels, say, and doesn't determine your review until the 20th of August. You've just got 3 days to submit your appeal to the awarding organisation. So it's very tight.
How long does the awarding organisation appeal? Will that decision be made prior to the start of term, university term, or actually before that? Because universities really by the beginning of September need to know who's coming and who isn't.
Well, I think they should be, and that's the idea, and that's the reason why they sort of have that priority process, because it's obviously the students will need to know where they're going before.
Okay, so if there does need to be appeals to awarding organisations, hopefully they should be resolved. Or I'm assuming what you do is you keep in constant touch with the admissions office and say, this is what's going on now, this is what's going on now.
Yeah.
So really there is, and if you are a school, the conducting the centre reviews, really, I'm sure most schools already have this, but you're going to need potentially a few members of staff on site and the governors, potentially, depending on the nature of the allegations, or on hand anyway. I mean, thank God for Zoom, to make decisions extremely quickly.
It's going to be tight, and unfortunately.
So kind of having adequate, and the other thing is that I think when this system was designed, there was a view that the number of COVID cases would be quite small. But as I speak, I know of at least 4 people who work in the teaching profession who've been diagnosed with COVID this week. So, and the isolation process doesn't finish until the 16th of August. So in fact, what you might need to do is have a think practically about, do I have enough people? Do I need to get some more people in? Do I need to get some admin people in to help with the collation of all the paperwork? I mean, hopefully you will have everything you need and you'll be able to make decisions relatively quickly, but some of these cases could be a little bit tricky. So, okay, so I don't have, say for example, I'm not taking my A-levels, or I've already decided to take a gap year, so it's not imperative for this year. What are the deadlines for the non-priority appeals? So that would be GCSEs and anything which doesn't involve higher education.
So for a non-priority appeal, to request a centre review, you have until the 3rd of September. Then the centre must complete the review by the 10th of September, and you then have until the 17th to submit an appeal to the awarding organisation. That's the 17th of September.
Now, I'm just thinking that's the same time as most schools go back. So this is all happening in the first week of term.
I mean, you can, exactly, it could be, and particularly because schools will be prioritising priority appeals, it is likely that a lot of this is going to happen just as schools return. So it will be a difficult time, obviously, particularly because schools still don't know quite how they're going to return, what the conditions for returning will be in September because of COVID.
So I think what I think we will both say, and I know this is an area close to Ben's heart as he's married to a teacher, is that teachers have had a very difficult time, and we know that this is an exceptionally large additional burden that has been placed on them this year. So we want to say thank you to all of them for all their hard work, particularly Ben's wife.
Absolutely, especially her. Absolutely.
So for these reviews to the school, so you say I'm sure that the maths teacher has got it wrong. And in fact, I'm called Joanna Harrison, but there's also somebody called Harrison Joanna, and I think they might have got that name mixed up. So could you tell me what the grounds of appeal in effect are to the school or the centre, the sixth form college, or whoever it is you're talking about?
So that particular example you could appeal on. So that is So there are two grounds of appeal. I mean, that's a sort of administrative error. So one of the grounds is you can appeal on the grounds you said the school has made an administrative error. It has mixed your grades up with somebody else, mixed your name up, mixed your marks up with somebody else. The other ground is that the school has failed to follow its procedures properly or consistently in arriving at the results. So an example of that is whether mitigating circumstances were in existence and considered at the time of the assessment. So if you broke your leg and you were off school for a long period of time, was that properly taken into account? And the JCQ guidance said that special consideration applications won't apply as they usually would for exams. So schools are meant to use work completed by a student when unaffected by adverse circumstances. But where that's not where that hasn't been possible, and a temporary injury or some other event out of their control has affected the student's performance, so the teachers should take that into account, but they should document how they've done so. And it comes back
I'm thinking in particular, there may well be, given the number of young people that had given that schools were the largest source of COVID, the most obvious kind of mitigating circumstance that you wouldn't be able to put in at the time that you put your teacher assessed grades in might be if people were all off or self-isolating at the time you were doing an assessment. I mean, my understanding is certainly for A levels that a lot of schools basically made their young people sit something that pretty much looked like an A level at roughly the same period, at the end of May, really, sort of between the middle and the end of May. So it would be likely to be a limited series of circumstances where they wouldn't have done that. But what in effect the guidance says is, if there is a sort of special circumstance, and I can, there are all sorts of things happen, your parents become ill, you lose a relative, you're ill yourself. Those are the most obvious examples, but they're by no means exhaustive. There's always been a process, and there continues to be a process for the school to either say, look, we're not going to look at anything she did in May, anything that Fiona did in May, because we know her mum had just died, but we are going to look at what happened in April, and we're going to take into account that it might not be quite as good as what she did in May. Looking at, so that should be the first thing you should do. And it's only if you can't do that, then the teachers should have taken into account your special circumstances and provided a rationale when they sent the grade in. But that can't apply to lost teaching and learning. So what you can't do, which is what I think a lot of teachers and parents would have liked to do, is to say, look, my child's been out of school pretty much on and off for the past 18 months, particularly if they're at the sort of school where there's been a lot of disruption because year group bubbles keep being sent home. I mean, you've had some cases. I know a colleague in our chambers has only, I think his daughter was only in for 4 days of one term because they would go back and then they would get pinged again. None of that can really be taken into account. But the guidance says you should use flexible sources of evidence. I mean, the one thing that I would say about that is, it's very hard after the fact to say, oh, I've got this special circumstance that I didn't tell you about. So, I mean, hopefully you should have said at the time, my mum's died, or I've been very unwell, or particularly this year, I think there's going to be a lot of issues to do with people with mental health problems caused by the pandemic, young people with some quite serious mental health problems. So hopefully the school should already have taken all of that into account. But if they haven't, or if they've forgotten to do so because they didn't get your email, or, I mean, it could just be something as easy as that, then you should be looking at that. The other area where lots of people ask questions is about reasonable adjustments. And again, this year, whether agreed access arrangements or reasonable adjustments were provided, in effect, what should have happened is the school, as it would have done if there was an exam, should already have put in the access arrangements or reasonable adjustments they were going to put in place, and they should already have been approved. Now, there's a system for doing that. It usually involves the provision of evidence from either specialist teachers or educational psychologists. And the idea was meant to be that the same adjustments were put in place this year as would have been put in place had you sat the exam. Now, obviously, those adjustments can only go so far. Those access arrangements can only go so far. It's never been the case that you've been able to kind of compromise the academic content, shall we say. So, for example, if you are deaf, you can't sit there and say, I shouldn't have to do the listening component of a French language exam, although it may well be unlikely that you were sitting a modern foreign language, but it's not impossible that that would be the case. But you could provide an adjustment in terms of a sign language interpreter to assist with that, or providing, you know, an ability to listen again and again if one's hearing is compromised but not utterly impaired. But the exam boards should have been able to provide you with information, and that should already have been done. So that's what should have happened. The issue, and that should have already been discussed between parents, students. But what often happens is parents say, well, we didn't know because there wasn't a diagnosis, or the diagnosis happened after, particularly in this case, if you are looking at, because there's a range of evidence that's going to be put in, it may well be that some of that evidence and some of those marks would have been assessed prior to you knowing that that individual had that particular disability or that adjustment was needed. And so what should have happened is that if, for example, you did a mock, and this is often the most common thing, we all did our mocks in January, or rather, in fact, most people didn't do mocks in January because they were all at home. But say you all did an online test in January, and that was one of the things that was taken into account. But actually, you found out in February that, in fact, you had a diagnosis of dyslexia. And of course, that wasn't taken into account. So you didn't get any extra time during that. And that was one of the components that was taken into account. And the teacher, when grading that piece of work as part and parcel of the evidence to give to the exam board, didn't take into account the fact that they should have given you extra time, then that would be an administrative error, and that would be a failure of process.
Yeah.
However, there are all sorts of extraordinary situations when can happen. So what you need to know is either they've made the adjustments, or if they haven't made the adjustments, there is it's their cock up. In effect, it's the school's cock up. And as a school, you should have, again, the relevant guidance is very big on, firstly, having discussed all this stuff in advance, and secondly, if you say no, we're not going to allow an access arrangement, you make it absolutely clear why not at the time. So what I wanted to know is, can you appeal simply on the basis that you think that, so I really don't like my maths teacher. I've told you that, that's the third time I've told you I really don't like my maths teacher. And I want to go and do medicine, so I've done maths A level. Can I appeal to the school on the basis that they just got my grade wrong?
No, I mean, you can't at all to the school. You could only bring an appeal that even sounded like that to the awarding organisation, and that's the sort of additional ground that you can bring, which is that the ground is that it's on the basis of academic judgments or unreasonableness.
Okay, so what does that? So okay, so the school says no, we're not changing your maths grade, Fiona.
Yeah.
We've done everything right. What can I do then? How can I appeal that decision, and where do I appeal it to?
Yeah, so you appeal that to your awarding organisation, and you allege
what's an awarding organisation then?
Yeah, sorry, that's your exam board. So
right.
That's the organisation that sets the exams and is formally awarding the grade. And you have to include in that form, well, I think the school, or as I said earlier, the centre has to make that appeal for you, and they have to include within that their reasons for why they haven't allowed any centre review, for example. I mean, it might be simply we don't have the jurisdiction to determine matters of academic judgment. So that's what you do now. But it's important to stress that it's not simply that will then be looked at by the awarding organisation. As I said, they might appoint an independent reviewer, but they're not asking. It's important to know they're not going to ask the question, should this have a different grade? They're asking, did the teacher award a grade which was reasonable to award? So they're looking at the judgment. I mean, it's accepting that there is a degree of variation in terms of academic judgment. One examiner, one teacher might award this, this particular answer 5 marks, another might award it 7. And actually it's not completely unreasonable to award it 5 marks, although you might disagree. So the reviewer might think, I'd give it 7, but it's not unreasonable to have given it 5. If that's the case, they're not going to change your grade. So, they are going to be looking simply at that question: did the teacher or the examiner act reasonably?
And do you also need to show that there would definitely have been a higher or a lower grade, or if you're a borderline candidate, for example? I mean, how does that work?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think, I think it's right to say that, and you might be able to correct me on this, but you need to show clearly and unequivocally that that what you've seen would have got a higher grade than the one you were awarded for them to sort of step in.
So if, for example, you're on the borderline of an A and an A star, it might be possible that the 5 and the 7 might actually have made a difference. So, I mean, not only do you have to show that the academic judgment was unreasonable, i.e. fell outside the range of reasonable opinions, and we've talked about the fact that there are one, but also you would have got a different grade. So if you were in the middle of a grade, even if you had gone up a few marks one way or another, you may well not have crossed the grade boundary. So that's something I think you also have to think about. Now, my understanding, Ben, am I right in thinking that other than academic judgment, you can also appeal in respect of administrative error if the centre has made an administrative error, or if they haven't followed their own processes? That's right. So that effectively awards you a second right of appeal really against the centre, because those are two of the same grounds which you can appeal to the centre on. If you don't agree with what the centre has said about those, you can add those obviously into your appeal to the awarding organisation, along with that other appeal on the academic judgment issue. And there are all sorts of quite complicated issues from my reading of the JCQ guidance. Well, it's not that complicated, but it's maybe more complicated than it needs to be, about what evidence and information you need to put in. Now, this is my understanding of the JCQ guidance, which may or may not be right. So if you say, right, okay, I want to appeal to the exam board, you have to put in information which says what the student says that the centre has failed to do. So again, schools are in this slightly peculiar position of having to say, we don't think, well, they may or may not have thought they've got it wrong, and I think we'll come on to that in a minute, but this is what student X says about what we got wrong, why that was a failure to follow the process, and why this was important to the decision about a teacher assessed grade. So all the time you have to think about not just has something gone wrong, but has that made any difference? And there may well be a number of circumstances in which it wouldn't in reality have made any difference. If, for example, looking at the rest of your portfolio of evidence, it's all roughly the same grade, or it all isn't a massively larger grade, then if it's to do with exercise of academic judgment, my understanding is that you have to send in the selection of evidence that you used in deciding the teacher assessed grade. If you're appealing on the basis of procedural failings of the school, or that they've used unreasonable academic judgment, the centre doesn't need to put in any additional rationale. However, if the argument that the student's running is you didn't put in place either special circumstances or reasonable adjustments, then you as a centre, when you're putting the appeal in on behalf of the student, have to say why you didn't do so. In effect, because otherwise the exam board isn't going to know why that was the case. And if the appeal is about academic judgment, but it's about the choice of evidence, again, you have to put in an explanation. So you have to say, this is why we chose the February essays, the April essays, and the May exam, rather than the January, March, and June, the essays at the beginning of June. And if the student is saying there's been an administrative error, you must explain what that error might have been. The other thing I think everybody needs to know is grades can go up and down. So as well as demonstrating unreasonable academic judgment, if it gets to the exam board and they look at the exams and they actually think that there's been an inflation of grades, they can reduce your grade. So I think one sometimes has to be careful with what you wish for. There is, however, handily another checklist at Appendix C of the JCQ guidance, what needs to be put in. So you can tick the box. In effect, you need to put in what evidence was selected, why it was chosen, why, if you've varied the evidence for this candidate rather than another, why that's the case. So that would be the special circumstances, mitigating circumstances largely. Reasonable adjustments, how they were taken account of, or if you didn't in fact undertake reasonable adjustments, how you looked at the assessment in that basis. Any discussion with parents, any evidence shared with the students about their marks, and any administrative errors. And Ben, not only can the student appeal, but the school can also appeal if it admits that it's got something wrong. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can. So the school can ask for an error to be corrected. So if they agree that the original grade was incorrect for administrative or procedural reasons, they can submit what's called a centre error correction request form. But it's ultimately for the exam board to decide whether that grade should change. So any submission must set out why the adverse effect the decision. So it must, it must set out what the adverse effect of the decision was and why it led to a lower grade than should have been awarded. And if this has happened to other students, because for example, if you pick up an administrative error, it's possible that the whole school has just made a copying pasting error or something like that. It could apply to other students. So you do need to also think about and regrade those, again depending on the adverse impact on those students, of allowing their grades to stand.
Yeah, so I think there's fundamentally a difference between, we've got something slightly wrong, so we've just mixed up, I don't know, 67 and 68, exactly. And you might sit there and think, well, actually that doesn't make any difference, so I'm not going to ask for a regrade. Or actually the teacher has transposed entirely the wrong. And look, there are 24,000 schools. There are probably, if everybody, let's just take A levels and GCSEs, children are usually doing 7 or 8 GCSEs, they're doing 3 or 4 A levels, there's probably 20 or 25 teachers that are going to be involved in that process. The likelihood of everybody putting all the data in perfectly all the time, it's just not going to happen. So there is going to be quite a bit of this. And what appears to be the case is that centres are encouraged, if they've got something wrong, in effect to say, look, we've got it wrong, can we regrade this? This is the way in which we want to regrade it. So a question I'm often asked is, that school down the road, they've completely fixed the grades, everybody's got A stars, and I know they shouldn't have got A stars. I remember them when I was at Brownies with them. No way did they have the right grades, or we know they've been fiddling the system. Now, what can you do about that?
Excuse me. Well, I honestly, I don't actually know the answer. I mean, that if it were true, would be malpractice. So you probably know better than me, Fiona, what remedy, if any.
Well, the thing is, the malpractice is, in fact, there have been some evidence of malpractice over the years, and certainly last year there was a deep degree of unhappiness by certain parents that certain schools had been heavy on the centre assessed grades and other schools had been lighter on the centre assessed grades. And there have also been occasions when teachers have been found to have, shall we say, stretched the rules slightly too far in how much assistance they provided to people in various ways. However, it is likely that nothing will come of this. And it is unlikely that it is malpractice. It may well just be that they had a very bright year, or in fact they marked it in a slightly different way, but not in a way which was unreasonable or fell outside the bounds of reasonable professional judgment. However, there is guidance about what is malpractice. In very rare circumstances, this does happen. And for example, things like entering students for exams they haven't done any teaching for. I mean, I can't quite believe anyone would ever do that, but apparently it happens. Grades given for students who hadn't been taught enough content. Now that tends to be a failure, and sometimes what has very occasionally come out is the entire department has, for example, taught the wrong syllabus, or not taught a whole part of an exam, and usually during the exam process you find that out. Not looking at published policies, fabricating evidence, and students as well can also be accused of malpractice. So that's if they fabricated the work, if they've plagiarized the work, or, and this is important, if students or parents have applied improper pressure on staff. If the pressure is seen as inappropriate, then the school has to tell the exam board that that's the case. And although again, I imagine that that is very rare, I'm not suggesting that that would never happen. What the centre then does, that is a very long process if you're dealing with malpractice. In effect, the exam board has to look into it, it has to carry out an investigation, and then it has to decide what to do. And it can decide to do nothing, it can decide to strip people of their exams, it can censure the entire centre, because if, for example, it's a kind of, we've taught the wrong syllabus, we're very sorry, or we haven't taught this major part of the A-level because we just cut it off when we were photocopying the syllabus 2.5 years ago. You know, these things do happen. It may well be that people's grades are revised on that basis. But I mean, malpractice is often spouted but rarely proven, would be the way that I would describe it, and you would need some pretty good evidence that that was the case. So you've gone through the internal process, you then go through the second stage of the process. There's then a third stage of the process. Ben, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
I can tell you a little bit. I mean, only a little, because I think the guidance was only very recently published, but
last week, the 23rd of July.
There you go. So that was last Friday, I think, wasn't it? So yes. Yeah, so that's called a procedural review, and it involves a body called the Exam Procedures Review Service, which is run by Ofqual, which I think you gave a bit of an introduction to earlier, Fiona. Yeah, it's not quite, I think, not quite clear that don't think all of the details are still clear. I think that's right to say, Fiona. So that there's some guidance for students which they intend to publish in due course. Now it's important to know that this, even if you're a priority appeal, this is not going to be completed before you have to start your new university place or whatever it is you go to. It only applies to GCSE, AS level, A level, and project qualifications. So as I think like extended projects and things like that.
Yeah,
so,
they're called advanced extension awards. Yeah.
But not to BTECs or T levels. It's slightly different from the other two sort of appeal, or from how it's operated in previous years. So it's things to watch out for, I think, are that the centre has got to submit the review appeal to the exam board where the learner requests it, and as with the other awarding organisation appeal, it can't say no. Students can apply directly to the EPRS if they're still unhappy. And their role is they really scrutinise what the exam board has done. So they're there to look at whether the exam board's followed its own procedures properly and consistently in respect of the following matters. So the issuing of results, the management of the learner's appeal, the correction or otherwise of any incorrect results it discovers in connection with the review and appeal processes, whether the exam board's issued results which reflect the teacher assessed grades submitted, whether it's followed an effective process to determine appeals submitted on the basis that the centre didn't follow its own procedures, whether it's identified any administrative errors made by the awarding organisation, whether it's had an effective process to decide appeals based on academic judgments, and whether it's had an effective process if it did find errors to decide if the result should be corrected and to correct it.
So thinking practically, the sorts of circumstances in which you might be bringing an appeal to the EPRS would be if the school felt that the grades had been awarded incorrectly by the exam board, so they messed something up, either administratively or they call it, because there is a degree of internal quality assurance that the exam boards are doing. So if, for example, they looked at the grades and thought they're all too high and brought them down a bit, that or if they felt that the exam board had been fundamentally unfair in changing the grades at one point or another, or had found some unfair criteria, or if it was felt that the academic judgment perspective, so the exam board's own internal process about academic judgment, weren't fair. So as a learner, you could say, look, I don't think you've looked at this the right way. But it's only really going to be those sorts of circumstances that is going to allow an appeal. And again, it's not an appeal on the merits, is it?
No, it's not. So it's really a procedural appeal. So they're not going to look at the substantive decision. They'll just look at how the decision was made. And, you know, we both know, I think as lawyers who do a lot of this sort of work, that, you know, these are very difficult to win. It's not impossible, but, you know, as I said, it is sometimes hard to get your head around the fact that no one's going to be looking at the merits. You know, they're just looking at the procedure.
Yeah. And again, even when you get to that stage, there's a two-stage review process. So there's going to be a filtering stage to say, is there any prospect of appeal? And if not, it gets thrown out at that stage. And then there's going to be, if it does go through that stage, then there's a little bit of an investigation and a meeting where everybody gets to say something. So this is quite a lengthy process. This isn't something, if you're ending up at this stage, the likelihood is either something quite badly has gone wrong with the exam board, or you're really already in the prospect of thinking, okay, I'm not going to be able to go where I want to go this year.
Yeah.
I mean, the other matter is the other thing to say is there a fresh exam process? Because last year they allowed people to take exams. In reality, I think it was something like they offered exams in everything and only about 5,000 people took them out of the 500,000 people who take the exams every year. Is that happening again this year?
Yeah, so you will be able to resit your exams. Well, particularly GCSEs and A-levels, and I think AS in certain subjects in the autumn exam series in 2021. And I think the dates for A-levels they're going to be in October, GCSEs in November and December. I don't think the dates have been published yet for when you need to enter those exams, but that I might.
Well, I would imagine that the entries will have to take place before the start of next term.
Yeah, most likely, yeah.
So the likelihood is what you might need to do is think about, do I appeal or do I just resit the exam? I mean, it may well be, you know, some people do brilliantly with assessments, other people are much better at doing exams. It may be that you sit there and think, actually, if I buckle down and do 6 weeks intensive work, for example, my teacher might say to me, don't appeal the grade, Fiona, just work really hard for 6 weeks and retake your maths, learning what you've already learned about where your strengths and weaknesses are. But of course, that will be before the university. So the university will know that you've resat and undertaken a different grade. Yeah. So, you know, it depends the position that you want to take. Well, there's obviously a lot to be done in a very short, basically 3 weeks from the 10th of August. If you're running a school, I think quite a few of the senior management team are going to be back on a full-time basis, aren't they? So I just want to say thank you to Ben and thank you to you all for listening. If you've got any questions or concerns, we are available. We hope that this exam process is less stressful, less fraught, and less chaotic than last year's was. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely summer. Bye-bye.
Bye.